British legend of King Arthur was that might does not make right, and that meant that intelligence was supposed to prevail over armed force, that the winner would be determined by brains and not by brawn, that victory could be due to something other than mere physical power, and the British thought they were the smartest cookies around. However, it was important to know that cleverness must not be mistaken for intelligence, and in war a bullet was more determinative than 10 times its weight in brains. The town of Austerlitz in the province of Utrecht in Holland had been given its name in honor of Napoleon defeating the larger Russian and Austrian allies of Alexander I and Francis II at the Battle of Austerlitz in Austria during the British-led war effort that ended the Third Coalition with the Treaty of Pressburg, and Bratislava was the Western word for Pressburg. Prussia had been offered the territory of Hanover to stay out of the Third Coalition, while Napoleon would offer Hanover to Britain as a peace offering, and France and Austria had immediately agreed to the Treaty of Pressburg on the 27th of December in 1805 after Napoleon defeated them in Austria at Austerlitz. And with the Treaty of Pressburg, Napoleon won Lüneburg and Austria lost Trieste, and within months the Austrian Emperor was forced to give up his title of Holy Roman Emperor lest it be given to the triumphant Napoleon. Francis too blamed the British for the deal they'd made with Prussia over Hanover, and after the defeat of Napoleon, the title of Holy Roman Emperor had been taken away from Francis II and shelved, but there was nothing to stop Hitler from bringing it back, since the Reich now comprised all the lands that had made up the Holy Roman Empire, and the one thing about those Nazis was they sure could sing. In August of 1920, all the Germanic head patriots in Austria and Czechoslovakia, Austerlitz, and the Greater Reich were meeting in Salzburg, and Hitler gave 2 speeches on the 7th and 8th of August, and he won them over, and they all vowed loyalty to the fatherland, and among these dedicated men was the war hero, Lieutenant Commander von Trapp. Sub-Lieutenant Dönitz had just been released from custody in Britain the month before, having been incarcerated since the armistice, and Hitler's first speech on the 7th of August in 1920 was called Volksgemeinschaft, or In Opposition to Class Thinking. The speech went on for hours, and they invited him back the following evening, and Hitler spoke for another hour and a half, and he was asked to speak again 2 months later on the 1st of October for a couple hours, and then he went again in 1923 to their August convention in Salzburg, and it had been to these leaders meeting in Salzburg in August of 1920 that Hitler had described the Weimar Socialists as a failure and a disgrace, and it was there that he had added the word national to socialism in order to make his vision to them unmistakably clear. Von Trapp was a resident of Salzburg, and that was where the abbey had been built during the days of Charlemagne, up in the hills on the north side of the Alps, erected onto solid rock with the base of the walls 9 feet thick, rising 300 feet straight up out of the valley. And when German troops marched into Salzburg on the 12th of March in 1938, the Hitler Youth lit solstice fires shaped like swastikas into the sides of the mountains surrounding Salzburg, those mountains where Julie Andrews would sing about the hills being alive. 2 days later, on the 14th of March, Hitler himself came to Vienna, the capital city of the Holy Roman Empire, and the church bells rang out and the crowds shouted for him well into the night, with no likelihood of going silent any time soon. So Hitler stepped out onto the balcony of his hotel and said, "What you are feeling now is something I myself have felt to the bottom of my heart in these 5 days. It is a great historic change which our German folk have undergone. What you are witnessing at this moment is something the whole German folk is experiencing with you, not only 2 million people in this city, but 75 million members of our Volk in one Reich. They are all deeply stirred and moved by this historic turning point, and they all consecrate themselves with the vow, no matter what may happen, the German Reich as it stands today is something no man will ever break asunder, and no man will ever tear apart. There is no crisis, no threat, no force that might break this vow. Today these are the devout words of all German beings, from Königsberg to Cologne, from Hamburg to Vienna. Pockets of communists opposed this Anschluss into Austria, especially in Bischofshofen. But they were quickly cleaned up in the next few days, and 72,000 Jew communists were arrested and sent to work in the camps. And in the Klesheim Palace outside Salzburg, Hitler was recorded as saying, "If the Jews do not want to work there, then they will be shot. If they cannot work, they will go to seed. They must be treated like the tuberculosis bacillus that can infect a healthy body. This is not cruel if you consider that even innocent creatures of nature, like the rabbit and the deer, are shot so they cannot do harm. Why should you be more kind to these beasts who want to bring us Bolshevism? Nations that do not fight off the Jews go to seed. The decline of the once so proud Persian people is one of the most famous examples of this. Today they lead as pitiful as an existence as the Armenians." It had been in Salzburg on the 1st of May, in 1938, that the good residents had burnt up the 1,200 Jew communist books they'd collected to feed into a bonfire that made the newsreels, and von Trapp from Salzburg had joined the Austrian Navy just as his father had before him. During the Great War, Austria had an outstanding navy operating out of the lovely port of Trieste, and von Trapp was given command of a submarine, one of the first experimental versions that were usually filled with engine exhaust, and the periscope could not be raised or lowered, but the whole boat had to be moved with the periscope. Von Trapp sank British convoys in the Adriatic Sea, and he destroyed enemy ships in German waters. And von Trapp became a hero in the Great War, and had the war continued, he would have been promoted much further than lieutenant commander, the equivalent of an army major. Von Trapp won the Cross of the Empress Maria Theresa for personal bravery in combat, the very highest medal there was, even though he'd acted against orders, since that was the nature of the award, that if the action succeeded, they would receive the Maria Theresa Cross, but if it failed, they'd be courts-martialed. His whole nation was proud of him. He was not only popular, but really beloved. And then it all turned out so differently. Austria was defeated and stripped of her entire seacoast. The proud imperial navy was no more. In the prime of life, near the peak of his fame, the captain was brushed aside in the whirlwind. The Story of the Trapp Family Singers by Maria Augusta Trapp, Philadelphia, J.B. Lippincott Company, 1949, page 27. In losing the Great War, Austria had also lost access to the sea, so von Trapp was out of a job. The Depression overwhelmed Austria in 1932, and the bank failed where von Trapp kept his money, and with 10 hungry children, the captain took his children onto the stage, even though he thought that appearing in public was bad manners because he was an aristocrat, but his second wife insisted. All the officers in the German army were aristocrats, but von Trapp had no other income, so they sang on stage for Hitler in 1936, and then they moved to Vermont and opened a ski lodge. There'd been a CCC camp in Vermont that the government was planning to tear down, so the von Trapps asked Uncle Sam if they could use it as a camp of their own. When I was a young girl, I attended several times so-called sing weeks. We met somewhere out in the country, groups of between 50 and 100, and we spent 8 or 10 days devoted only to music making and folk dancing. I haven't seen that done in America yet. Couldn't we start them in that camp? The Story of the Trapp Family Singers, page 254. The von Trapps had 8 barracks on the top of a hill with 3 more at the bottom used for a kitchen and some dining rooms, and the Von Trapps installed plumbing and put in the latest in kitchen machinery, and they hired a Chinese cook, and they turned the guardhouse into a chapel. While Hitler's war raged in Europe, the Von Trapps welcomed their first 100 guests to their singing camp, and all the locals showed up for the grand opening, with the governor of Vermont giving a speech as the American flag was raised. At home in Austria, a farm was a self-sustaining independent unit. You tried to grow a little bit of everything for the people and for the animals, and a little more than enough to sell to buy the few items you couldn't grow, such as coffee, tobacco, and cotton material. The wool of your own sheep was spun at home and woven or knitted. The pigs supplied you with smoked meat for the whole year, and lard besides. For sweetness you had your honey. The flax of the fields provided all the linen. Eventually you slaughtered some beef cattle or a sheep or some geese, ducks, chickens, to get variety in your menu. In the orchard behind the house you had cherry, apple, and pear trees, and in a protected corner even some peaches and grapevines. In the vegetable garden was a berry corner for strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, gooseberries, and currants. From your own rye you baked that delicious black bread, and you always kept enough grain for next year's seed. That way each farmer on his homestead was an independent little king in his own realm. The Story of the Trapp Family Singers, page 215 and 16. 2 of the Von Trapp boys fought for the U.S. in Europe and would visit their old town in Austria to find out that Himmler had used their house as his headquarters, and that he had slept in their parents' bedroom, and that the Nazis had used their chapel as a beer parlor, and the Von Trapps were given their house back after the war, but they didn't want it anymore, so they sold it to a religious group from America. Major Von Trapp would die of lung cancer on the 30th of May in 1947, and he was buried using his old U-boat flag as a blanket. And Maria wrote a 14-page letter for the funeral that said in the last paragraph, "It seems to have been cancer after all. A few weeks after his death I heard of a doctor who, in his own practice, had had 17 cases of cancer of the lungs, of which every single patient was a U-boat man from the First World War. Thus it would not be impossible that the Trapp died a hero's death, true till the last flag was furled." The Story of the Trapp Family Singers, page 299.